and then developing stormwater plans. We'll look at a number of examples of stormwater plans. We're discussing that there's a lot of different ways you can draw these up, and so we'll look at some examples of that. So going out to work with landowners, we spent time looking at these properties. Working with the landowners is going to give a lot of other good information about the site and concerns that the landowner might have, preferences for different types of plants, a lot of things that'll become evident with working with the landowner. We have our list of things to bring along for the site consultation, and we did have a number of these out on site. This is a smaller version of a soil core that you can push down in the ground and take a look at the soil. We didn't really use the graph paper. For the graph paper, you would need more time to do that. It works well to start with the aerial photograph. And we did talk a bit about doing that. Doing a sketch ahead of time using the aerial photograph. And then when you go out and do your measurements, you can get all your measurements down, and then you can kind of refine that process, refine your drawing more. And you don't necessarily have to measure everything on site. Key parts are the impervious areas where you may be wanting to place a rain garden or a rain barrel, getting those measurements down. The graph paper can work well to have like 1 square be 2 feet. If you're out there drawing a site in, you can kind of use the squares for measurements, and that can work pretty well. So we've looked at our checklist. Property maps, you can get your own property maps. And in our rain garden design resources handout, we do have the list of sites that you can go to for aerial photographs. We've looked at examples of that. You've had those as handouts. So you can type in an address in this example and get to the site that you're looking for.
Dan, those square views that were on the previous one, were those on the map or were those put on?
Those would be on the map, on the website.
So the website includes like 372 and the 350. Oh, there.
Yeah, that's already there. And then in a lot of these sites there'll be layers you can turn on or off as you need to. So you can get some useful information off of these.
So Roxanne took a lot of the measurements and most of them are up here, and then Carol, you've got some as well that we can fill in. So those are...
Oh, great.
I don't know who you were...
That'll be good as we get to the design phase, looking at the measurements. Google, Bing, different programs, you can also get street views. So sometimes before you go out on a site, you can get a view of what the property looks like. Sometimes that might be useful. And then, you want to read it? Close that up for now. When we're talking about the details for rain garden design, we talked about sizing, and a typical depth is usually about 6 to 9 inches. Again, if you don't have these handouts, we can get these out to you. We have this rain garden design resource where we summarize the percolation test and looking at the rain garden depth that you would want based on the soil type. So 6 to 9 is pretty common. The average.
So we did a perk test on ours, and then one of the designers looked at it and said, I wouldn't make that. So the calculation was 12 inches. I would make it that deep. So even though the perk test says 12, you do it 6 to 9 instead.
Yeah, a lot of times it's when you look at the lawn, you look at how deep that might be in a certain situation. sometimes 12 inches is deep, and it's just going to look too deep. And so that's where you might want to do it smaller. Maybe you'll have an opportunity to do a secondary one to catch some secondary flow, maybe further down the slope. And so you really do need to size them to the property. And so if it's looking like it's going to be too deep, then I would make it more like 9 or something like that. So fitting into your landscape and the context is all related to that depth. We looked at cross sections in that details class, for those of you that were there, and we talked about the importance of having a flat base. We kept stressing that over and over again. Make sure that base is flat so you get the water going down evenly. You're not stressing the plants because you have that flattened base. Compost is common to mix in, but then also loosening down about another foot. To get that soil loose, you're going to get quick infiltration when that water does get to your rain garden. Making sure you put the mulch down before you plant so you're not compacting that again, because you don't want to loosen that up and jeopardize how much infiltration you'll have happening. And so here's the percolation test example. Again, we have that summarized here on the sheet. I won't go into detail. I know not all of you were at that details class, but read through this description here. If you have the Blue Thumb Guide to Rain Garden, there's a good description in there on doing the percolation test also. So that is what will help you decide how deep your rain garden should be. And it's essentially about a foot by, or about 8 inches by 8 inches, which is pretty common for the hole. Fill it with water once, let it drain down. Put a popsicle stick in there, fill it up to that level, and then come back after about an hour and measure how far down it went. Is the way we're most commonly doing it. Yeah.
On the picture before, the slide before, the rain garden went right up to the
Photo?
yeah, the photo, sorry.
Oh, the photo, yep.
No, he didn't mean backing it forward, like wherever you want to be right now.
There. Okay, yeah.
He went back. Okay, I was getting my direction. But where the sidewalk is that sloped down a little bit into the rain garden? Because that's a real similar situation to what I'm looking at.
Yeah, and this is similar to what we just looked at as well. We were talking about that lower piece of that driveway. We might be able to do a curb drain or drain in the driveway to bring the water in. So you can do something like this in that situation. I think the thing I'd be conscious of here is making sure there's not going to be a lip there so that somebody walking on there is going to twist their ankle. But you can then have it go down, and that's what's happening here if it's going down.
Okay.
All right, so you're having a bit of a depression there that's going to collect water.
Yeah, don't be putting any ankle twisters out there. There you go. We will have words.
That heavily mulched area above and beyond those rocks, is that gardened as well, or?
Yeah, there's plantings that were done in here. There's a series of images of this site later
Okay.
on, and it shows at different stages of development.
Okay,
That's just creating a little more buffer there.
yeah,
They could have potentially pulled that rock back here, but then it's making it pretty narrow
yeah,
stretch there, maybe getting a little closer to the foundation than they'd like.
okay.
So, there's a lot of different options with rain garden. Here's another one that has a wall that's stepping down from a lawn. So instead of going with a really steep slope there that's hard to mow and it speeds up water, that can be helpful. Using edges again, and that last one we looked at, if it was put along the driveway, we have that edge there already. So it creates a little bit of order there. This one has bringing water down through a rock waterway, and we looked at that as an option, or I guess both of them potentially. as a way to get water away from the house, but you'd want to line it.
What would you line it with? What do you line it with?
Usually I use pond liner. You can get those at a lot of different places. And that's going to be the strongest. You could use a heavy plastic. That doesn't tend to last as long. But that could be an option as well. And so as you're getting it away from the house, that's where you don't want it infiltrating. So getting it down to a rain garden down below.
Pond liner there rubber, or is that a heavy duty plastic?
It's a rubber. And they use it for roofing as well. You know, flat roof, same stuff. Here, drinking water, they brought it across here into a rain garden. Again, here you can see it's right up against the driveway there. So again, using those edges. This might be a little problematic sometimes with, you know, rock shifting and things, but could see it working. This one,
But instead of putting rocks in the middle of what looks like permeable paper, couldn't they have put something underneath it?
you could.
Because that looks like it would be hard to shovel.
Yeah. But I think they're catching some of the sheet flow happening here, but they're also getting water coming down here, and it's catching there.
Well, that's true.
And so that's where this might be beneficial to kind of catch some of that. Other sites, rain garden will be going in here, but new walkways going in. Rain garden in the middle. Yeah, that's the same site. So again, these edges are nice because they're creating order within that design. Another one up against the walkway. This one is kind of built up a little bit, and then you'll have the depression back there. It doesn't even really look like a rain garden necessarily.
But it's,
Now, if you do have extra soil, you can look for opportunities to kind of move that elsewhere on your property. Here's that same one that was up along the walkway up in front. This one had water coming in from all their neighbors, so they had a really wet backyard. And so they were looking for ways to deal with some of that moisture. And in this case, they collected water back here in the backyard, but then brought that overflow up in front as a secondary way to deal with stormwater. So this is an underground pipe. And it's kind of a long stretch, but as long as you have a good 2% slope going, you can keep that water moving pretty well. We did talk last time about potential icing issues and things, but as long as you keep it moving, you keep it unobstructed, you can have good flow of water. Another example, let's see if I can move this way a little so I don't keep getting into this is adding on to existing landscaping, a different variation. There's a lot of water's coming down the downspout, digging a crescent-shaped depression around the planting, so not disturbing the existing planting. It'll collect the water. This one doesn't really have a flat base. This is maybe an exception to the rule.
because it's almost more of a swale, right?
It's more of a swale. You'll see that they planted iris in it, which can handle quite a bit of water. So maybe a swale is okay with the vegetation they chose. So then their berm is going to be the overflow. So you want to make sure this is perfectly level here. So you kind of get sheet flow going over that berm. And then they use fabric over that. You could probably use wood chips as well. Fabric would hold more. Then using pussy toes, which is a low-growing native plant in front, and then wild iris in the lower portion. That one. Sorry, a little repetition. This is the backyard of this one. Really shady back here. And this John Tracy, who designed this, put in a lot of sedges that can grow in shade, like fox sedge. was one of the dominant sedges, and then a lot of different ferns in there, like obese or sensitive fern. And then this is up in front before they put in the rain gardens in front. This is after. So you can see the rock is creating a lot of order there. Yeah, question?
What sedge was that, you said?
Fox.
Sedge?
What's the-
Fox sedge. So the pipe is coming in over here, and then you have a gentle depression. So here you can see there were more plantings put in here also, up above where that mulch was located. Apartment buildings. I've worked on some sites like this. It can be really tricky because it's real common you get water coming in between buildings like this, and so you need to find a way to bring it out. And this is where pond liner can be useful to create a swale to come out, where you're not letting any water go down because these will have basements in them, and so you want to bring that water out to where you can infiltrate it. So that's what's being done on these sites, is bringing that water out to a rain garden. This is one that Rusty worked on. I don't know if he showed this or not. It's at his daughter's school. So they put a riser on that drain pipe to keep the water from going down in there. Used mulch. They didn't remove the grass ahead of time. They just mulched it really heavy. And that was enough to suppress the weeds. See him putting the mulch on in the rain. You can see the riser on the drain. And then planting afterwards.
Did it loosen the soil on that one?
No, I don't think they just put that mulch over the grass. So must have been a sandy enough soil. I'm guessing that maybe they feel they didn't really need to loosen it very much.
That was the same school, that one, the one
Yeah.
that's a year later.
Yeah. So bergamots, marsh milkweed, like hoary vervain, common oxeye, black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, some of the pretty common plants that we use in rain gardens. All right, so now we're getting to the design portion, and one of our handouts that you should have is the stormwater plan checklist. Oh, okay. Yeah, some of you may have it. Here, for anybody that doesn't have this, we'll pass these around. So this is a checklist of things that are commonly put onto a stormwater plan, like you'd be developing for the sites that we were looking at. Homeowner's name. The scale. Trying to fill up the whole page if possible for the design, but we'll be looking at some examples. It is helpful to have a scale on there. If you can add one, you'll notice that there's a scale here on this one of the site that we'll be working on, and it says 1 inch equals 10 feet, but if you put a scale on here, 1 inch is, well, it's not 1 inch, I guess is the main point. This section of the scale should be showing an inch. So when you reduce these down, then the scale isn't going to be accurate anymore. But it is still helpful to have that on there because you can still know that, okay, this area is 10 feet on here. This is designed to be 11 by 17, the sheet. And so at 11 by 17, 1 inch would be 10 feet. We mentioned with the graph paper, if you're using graph paper, you make one square 2 feet, and you look at how many squares is in an inch, it's 8 of them. So 1 inch would be 8 feet. So you could use that as kind of a way to help you kind of measure things out on site. Property boundaries, pretty common to do those as a dashed line. It's kind of a pretty common convention to use dashed lines for property boundaries. Catchment boundaries, those are the areas that your water is coming from going to your rain garden. So that's like your little watershed on site is your catchment. And it's pretty common to make those in a red line. It's not essential, and you don't always draw these on, but can be useful. Showing the roof lines, and we do have that. We do have that on the site. We've been looking at the buildings, and the garage and the house show up well. You can see those are in a darker line, and so it's common on plans to show buildings in a dark outline, so that you know that that's a building, not a road. The road's a little smaller line here. So that's one way to help represent on these what's a building and what's another hardscape there. So they're common to have a key. We did pass this out as a handout and an example. This has a key on it showing what the different colors and symbols mean on this stormwater management plan. This is one that was done by computer. We mentioned we'll look at others that were done by hand.
Are there decent open source drawing programs that we can use or that you can recommend?
No, there isn't
Yeah, I didn't think so.
that are good free
I
sources.
recommend one.
Really?
Okay,
Draft site.
draft site,
It's like AutoCAD, and it's free.
okay.
I had good luck using PowerPoint, putting my aerial photo of PowerPoint, drawing rows and shapes and stuff.
Yeah, no, I wanted to be able to draw like this.
Yeah, a lot of the like Metro Bloom's been using Adobe Illustrator. Photoshop can work. There's a lot of different programs, drawing programs that can work. The nice thing about like AutoCAD is that it's very exacting. You can get all the exact lines. I haven't seen the draft site. I'm going to look that up.
It's the same as AutoCAD 10, 2010.
Oh,
It's
great.
just 2E.
Okay, it's free. Oh, so that could be a great resource to use if you don't want to be doing it all by hand. A nice thing about being able to do it in the computer is you can save it, come back to it, make revisions, and that's hard to do by hand.
Yeah.
Check areas too.
Also having north arrows. See homeowner name, address, phone number, and then pretty common to print them at 11 by 17 if you have that ability, but that's not essential. You can be doing them smaller also. So other things to show on them, the total property area. It's common to put on the plans. And so this one has approximately 15,000 square feet for the total property. Total percent impervious surface. This has that as well, impervious surface area. That way you can calculate how much of the impervious area you've been able to treat on site. And then impervious area treated by the rain garden, so the area that you are treating. And then BMP recommendations. And so your stormwater plan, that's, I guess, the meat of your plan is your solutions that you're drawing on the site. So it would be showing the rain gardens, rain barrels, impervious, or impervious paving, anything that you're using on site to treat stormwater. Also showing downspouts with direction, flow direction. We looked at that quite a bit on site, and some of you were drawing the little arrows on your site assessment maps. So that would be useful information. Low spots, rain gardens, native plantings, permeable paving, rain barrels, canopy tree plantings, could be native plantings or shrub plantings. So all of that would go on to your plan that you would be developing. So this is the one that we handed out. One other thing to note on here is that it's helpful to have an area for notes, because there's going to be things about these sites that you can't really portray well through a graphic. And maybe it's a note to remind yourself, or if a contractor is going to be installing it, notes to inform them about what's happening on the site. Special considerations would go into the notes piece. So this is showing drainage for each downspout. So showing here these areas, rain barrel locations, native planting. This has some pretty extensive native planting areas on site. Permeable pavers that are planned. Property line is that dashed line around the outside. Rain garden basin. So 2 rain gardens planned for this site. Downspout flow direction of the arrows. So now we'll get into a few examples of other plans that have been drawn up for sites. You can see this one's real similar to the one we just looked at, but this has been hand drawn. It has the flow arrows. A lot of labeling on here. This one didn't use a key to represent things like rain barrels, but they do have labels. Rain barrel opportunity, native grass planting opportunity, native planting opportunity up here, again showing the direction of flow, showing where the alley is. So I think maybe when we draw ours here and do some practice, we'll maybe leave this one up, because this is a good example of a hand-drawn version. I better speed up because we're going to run out of time. Another computer-generated one. I believe these were done in Adobe Illustrator. Pretty similar to the one that we handed out. One that's hand-drawn and then placed into a computer layout. So that can be done as well. You can scan it and then bring it into a program like Illustrator or Photoshop. It has the notes again, proposed rain garden location, showing the flow arrows. We're going to skip that one for now. And then you can get down to finer detail, but usually this is going to be a separate plan that you would draw. You're not going to be able to fit this on that stormwater plan that you're working on. You're going to need a separate sheet to draw these. And the things that you'd be putting on here are pretty similar. So this is one separate rain garden. Last time we talked a lot about trying to group plants together. So here you can see that there's plants grouped together, then they're using a number key to show what species are in that rain garden. They still do have a scale here, north arrow, the notes. Another example, different version or different variation here. They have a symbol and they have the quantity on here. And so for A, that's Ronia melanocarpa black chokeberry, and they're showing that they'd have 3 of those on site. So here's A. You're connecting these up with a line. It's common for landscape design to kind of use a line to connect up. And so that's chart that's showing how many of each plant. This one does have a site plan, kind of a rougher site plan, and then a rain garden down below. So these are kind of 2 separate graphics here. And then notes in there. And this one has a little more detail for a rain garden drawing. But again, using a key, but they're saying how many of them in here. So another variation. You can see that people are doing these in a lot of different ways. So we're running out of time, so there's some more pictures here of different things, like design elements, but I think we'll get everybody started looking at doing some example drawing. And we'll leave this up as an example. So if you can take out this plan that was at our last site, and so we'll be looking at this. And if you want to work in groups, that would be fine to talk about some of the information that you gathered on site with the flow arrows. Take out your checklist for developing a stormwater management plan and use that as a guide for what you can include on here. Maybe, well, there's an area for notes on there. You can add some notes on there as well. Key things about that site. So I know you'll be working off of memory a little bit. And then we do have some measurements that were collected on the site that we can share with you as well.
So we want you to know how to look at them, because you're going to encounter them. Once you know, you can't not know. So when you look at a rain garden, you're going to go, oh, I wonder if there's weeds in there. Oh, I wonder if there's silt built up there. Oh, so we want you to know. So that's what tonight is about. Ask questions as they come up. But Dan is with us again.
Excuse me,
Thank you so much.
can I just,
Yes.
I asked you last time if I
Yes,
could bring
we have
a
a
guest,
visitor.
and this is my brother James Hammond from Nordsjælland, Denmark. And long before I thought of or had any conception of coming to this class, we keep in touch, and he said, I made the choice to spend lots of extra money and put permeable pavers in my new driveway a year and a half ago. We had not done rain gardens, but that was when I knew that when he arrived at my house to stay with me for a week, I wanted to invite him to come.
Oh, that's such a good thing. Thank you so much for being with us, James. It's wonderful to have you. Other comments before I turn it over to Dan? All right. Have a good night.
All right, hello everyone. So tonight we'll be talking about evaluation of rain gardens. And there are lots and lots of rain gardens out there, and there is a lack of staff to review them and look at them. That may be a role that you'll have in the future. So we want to talk about the maintenance of rain gardens and other BMPs, and focus on that topic, looking at seasonal issues to look at, and then we'll get into different types of evaluation. There's recognition-based evaluation, which is what we'll focus the most on, and then there's regulatory, which gets into more detail and is more intensive, and we'll touch on that as well. And feel free to ask questions as we go through. So this is a summary of some of the main things that we'll be interested in looking at with rain gardens. Sediment accumulation is one of the big causes of failure of rain gardens. If you have a lot of fine sediment moving in, they can plug them up pretty fast. So depending on where your inlet is, that's going to be a key place to look at for sediment accumulation. And so that'll be one thing to inspect. Trash building up. Sometimes these can be places where trash blowing around will collect because it's depressed a little bit more, and there's plants there that collect some of the trash. Blocked or clogged inlets or outlets. Weeds are invasive plants, and we'll talk quite a bit about different weeds, and hopefully we'll get out later on today and we'll look at some plantings and talk about any weeds that are in them. And the weeds and invasives is something that I think for all of us, we kind of learn that over time. You know, what's a weed? What are the good plants in these gardens? It just takes a while. It takes a lot of repetition. Helps going out with people that know it well. And so that sometimes takes more of a learning process. Bare soil and erosion. And then if the water is standing too long. We talked about designing our rain gardens so they drain through in 24 hours, ideally. But if they're standing for 48 hours or more, that's when we start getting pretty concerned that the water is there too long, could promote mosquitoes possibly. So I think one key point with rain gardens is and it's true with native plantings in general, sometimes they're promoted as very low maintenance or no maintenance. That's not really the case. They do take maintenance. They're a garden. There's going to be weeds coming in. Even if we do good mulching with the gardens, we're going to have some weeds showing up. So there's going to be some maintenance involved with any planting that we're doing, and so you need to be prepared for that maintenance. Well, we're trying to minimize that maintenance and make it as efficient as possible. Yeah.
Is this PowerPoint going to be posted on the website?
Yeah, it'll be along with all the other ones.
Details.
Yeah, it'll get posted, and it'll be with the other ones, and I assume all the other ones have been up. And so don't feel like you need to write down everything, maybe just the key points, things that stand out. We talked about native plants, the importance of those, that they can be more drought tolerant and can last better within some of these gardens. So that's another reason that we are focused on native vegetation, the hardiness of them, that you can rely on them to be back each year. Once you have good vegetation and the planting is pretty well established, the weeding minimizes. But it's usually the first 2 or so years that you really need to focus on the weeding more, being really attentive. Then it's going to be a little bit less from there. But all through future of the planting, you'll need to pay attention to the weeds. We'll talk about seasonal issues for rain gardens and paying attention for all 4 seasons, making sure that you're thinking about different things that may come up. So starting with spring, that's when we'll have a lot of snow melt, and you can have a lot of water flowing into these rain gardens. And so that's when it's important to check anything that's flowing in, any pipes, channels, make sure things are flowing okay, because you don't want water to back up during that time. Sometimes you can have ice accumulation in these rain gardens, and you don't want that plugging your inlet if you do have a pipe coming in, because then it'll back up the pipe and it'll be accumulating closer to the house. So pay attention to that in the spring. Also, with native plants, we talked about leaving them through the winter in a lot of cases for birds and other wildlife to use. We also maintain some visual interest through the winter, but then chopping them back in the spring. So we talked about kind of chopping them up pretty fine with clippers and leaving that material in place. So kind of cutting that material. If it's filling up too much, removing some of that so that you don't just have too much buildup in the garden. Doing any weeding through the spring, and then mulching as well through the spring. You may need to add mulch periodically just to help suppress weeds, help maintain moisture for the plants. That mulch is going to have a few different functions in the planting. So again, inspecting the flows, the water coming into the site. So if you have a downspout coming into a catch basin, you're going to then have a pipe underneath. Just making sure that all of that is flowing as it's intended, that you're not going to have any water issues. And we can get some really big storms earlier in the year, and so you want to just make sure that's all in good working order. Make sure the downspouts are directed to the right place, that they're not onto the pavement where they're going to carry any pollutants down towards storm sewers. So make sure they're pointed in the right location. If there's berms on the site, checking to make sure that they're secure, that there's no gaps in them, there's no erosion. Sometimes critters start to burrow into them a little bit, and so just make sure that everything is in good shape with the berms. You can have water flow out if that's not the case. The removal of duff. So removing last year's material could be a good practice to collect that material and compost it. So if you have a lot of material that more than you want to leave in the rain garden after you kind of chop it down, moving that off and composting it, then it can be reused in the landscape. Here you can see they're chopping with the clippers. removing the height of that vegetation. And you can leave a fair amount of that in the garden if you choose. And you may not need to add as much to it. And then weeding, I think it does take a while to be able to identify all the weeds. And that's part of the reason that we talked about planting in masses, so that you can tell what's the good plant and what's the weed. It makes it a little easier than if everything is interspersed in the garden. So as you're learning the weeds, that will help a bit. There are certain weeds that seem to show up a lot in rain gardens. One is Creeping Charlie, partly because it creeps in from the edges of the gardens and moves in. Creeping Charlie. And that's part of the reason we promote edging around gardens, so that the lawn doesn't start creeping in, because the Kentucky bluegrass will do the same thing, start moving in. Lamb's quarters, dandelion, horseweed, pretty common weeds that we see show up in gardens. We have a handout here of a few other weeds. There can also be woody plants that start showing up in these gardens, like buckthorn and honeysuckle, because they produce a lot of seeds, and as birds fly around, they'll drop them and end up in rain gardens. So that could be another thing that we watch for. As you get that handout, you see that we do have common buckthorn on the list. And you just get those little seedlings showing up. And it's good to pull them early, because they start getting their root done, and once their root gets really well established, then they're hard to pull up. So the sooner you get them, the better. Burdock is a plant with that really large leaf, and that produces a lot of seed. It has that round seed head that collects onto clothing, and so that's a good one to catch, because once it starts seeding, it'll produce a lot of seed, and then you have a bigger problem, so you don't want to catch that early. Butter and eggs, it's on here. That likes dry locations. Canada thistle is probably the most likely thistle that you'll see showing up in these gardens. And it does spread underground, so if it gets established, then you have more of a problem. So try to catch that early and pull it out as soon as you spot it. And it'll go down a ways when you pull it out. There'll be quite a bit of root that'll come with it. Creeping Charlie, garlic mustard, plant that we've been really concerned about as an invasive plant, and likes moist soils, so that can be a concern. Reed canary grass, I do a lot of wetland restoration work, and that's our biggest nemesis. We have a lot of trouble with reed canary grass, and that spreads underground, produces a lot of seed, so it's a tough one to deal with. And then Tartarian honeysuckle is another one. And if we have time to look at sites, we'll look at some other weeds out there and look at other problems that we encounter. Usually we're trying to hand pull these weeds as much as we can, minimize herbicide use within these gardens, because you're going to have insects and things that are going to be using them, so we're trying to hand pull. Sometimes if you get some plants that are pretty well rooted, it can help to use like a dandelion digger or a garden fork or something to kind of loosen the soil up, and then pull up the plant and hopefully get the rhizomes up, so that you don't need to use herbicide. Quackgrass is another one that'll send out a lot of rhizomes, so it's good to try to work it up and get all the rhizome out, because if it breaks off, it'll come up and continue spreading. So you need to get as much as you can. We've talked about mulch quite a bit. Double shredded hardwood mulch is a preferred option for mulching these rain gardens. Doesn't float well. It creates a really good mat as well to prevent weed growth. So it has a lot of fine material there. It doesn't have a lot of gaps in it. So it'll help prevent weeds. We try to maintain a 3-inch layer. So it's a pretty good layer. So we try to maintain that over time, just to keep suppressing weeds, keeping that moisture in the garden. So there's a lot of good things that mulch does within the gardens. visually kind of keeps things looking neat as well. We did talk about trying to use double shredded hardwood, trying to avoid mulches that aren't local, like cypress mulch, things that are coming from a long ways away, in that case Louisiana, things that are more sustainable in the garden. So moving into summer, inspecting flows and drainage. You can get some really large storms, so we want to look at how the water is flowing through the rain garden. Hopefully the garden's been designed with a flat base and the water's going to spread out evenly in that garden. If it isn't, you may need to do some alterations. So watching that flow that goes through the garden, continue weeding, doing any watering that's needed. Hopefully you're not going to need to do much watering because this is going to be lower in the landscape. It's going to have water flowing into it periodically. So it should stay, it should have more moist soils than the surrounding areas. So you shouldn't have to do much weeding or much watering in the rain garden. And then a good time to take pictures. We'll talk about that with the evaluation process, that as you go out and evaluate gardens, that's when you should be taking pictures as well. And so the summer's a really good time to be doing that whole process, getting good pictures of the gardens. So with the flows and drainage after large storm events is a great time to go out and look at it, see how the water's sitting in the garden. If it does have a flat base, it should kind of sheen out and then it'll be infiltrating hopefully pretty quickly. Looking at how quickly it does infiltrate, that you're not having that water pool there and accumulate on the surface. And again, looking for erosion. If you've had really large storms like we've been having, it's a good time to go in and look at how everything is sitting, if you've had any mulch that's been moving out of place. Because if you get really big flows coming in, that's when you can have things start to move around a bit. Then always look for opportunities to slow the flow. If you find that you are getting some channels forming, that's something that you don't want because that's when you'll start getting erosion. And so maybe planting plants that have a lot of rhizomes in those areas to kind of hold that in place. If it seems really bad, maybe using some cobbles or some stone there to slow that flow of water so that it's not going to cause any issues. Talk quite a bit about weeding. The volunteer trees, that is something to watch out for because they will get well rooted pretty fast sometimes and then they're hard to pull out. And then you need to kind of dig in there to get at the root or get some other, like a weed wrench or something to pull them out. So trying to get those early is important. Some that we get concerned with box elder, cottonwood, buckthorn, ash elm, hackberry, mulberry. Those are all species, woody plants that will seed into these BMPs and start establishing. Some of them are desirable plants that we like, so maybe you could move them somewhere else or put them in a pot or something if you want to try to use them. Just not with buckthorns. Watering. So try not to water too much in these gardens. Again, they're sitting lower, and so they shouldn't really need much watering. But if things really get dry, if you really get drought conditions like we had last summer, things may start looking somewhat unhealthy in these gardens, and you might need to run a hose in them for a while. And if your base is flat, the water will spread out. It'll help water that planting pretty quickly. And then maybe just on the edges, you need to do some additional watering. If you have a rain barrel, it's a great source to do the watering. But this is definitely what we're trying to avoid. If you're seeing too much ponding and pooling like that, that's not a good sign. And it's a sign that it's maybe a rain garden that got too compacted during construction and is holding water too long, or maybe has a lot of sediment that builds up and it's kind of created a impermeable layer over the top. So that's something to look for is after these big storms, making sure that water is moving fast enough.
What do you do about this? you dig it
Well-
up and start over?
It depends on how severe the compaction is. You know, that type of thing has happened with really big bioretention areas because contractors have driven all over them with bobcats. And then you have so much compaction that they need to redo that planting. They probably need to go in there with a ripper on their bobcat or another machine that's going to rip through and break that up. The smaller rain garden, you might be able to go in with like a garden fork and re-loosen it up. And that might be enough to get your infiltration rate back up. If it's sediment accumulation, let's say there was construction nearby and a whole bunch of sediment flowed in, then it's going to be a matter of removing all that sediment out of the mulch, getting it back down to that level, design level, and hopefully that's going to be enough. Then you got to big new mulch and kind of reinvigorate that plant. So it kind of depends on what the cause is and how severe it is. Seems like we're always looking for good pictures of BMPs, partly to promote them, also for recognition of planting. So as you're doing evaluations, again, that's a great time to take pictures, or after you completed your project, it's looking really good, make sure you take pictures of them. That's something that we're always looking for. And then we get the fall. Inspect drainage and garden composition. Fall's a good time to look at the planting because pretty much everything will have grown and established, matured. You'll probably have some fall blooming things in the garden like some asters and goldenrods. And it's just a good time to kind of look at planting overall, see how the plants are behaving, if you have any other weed issues that are happening in that planting. It can be a good time to kind of clean things up before winter. And just make sure everything is working in that rain garden. You can get a lot of leaves accumulating, so you might have some drainage issues resulting from leaves accumulating within gutters. Those can flow down into pipes, so making sure that everything is staying clear and you have the water flowing how you want it. You may get a lot of leaves building up in the rain garden itself. Some are okay as a mulch layer. Sometimes they'll help protect the plants over winter if you have some there. But you don't want too thick of a layer because that's just going to decompose and form too much of a dust layer in the garden. Again, making sure everything's working as intended. And maybe able to assess whether the plants were successful or not. At that time of year, just look at the planting and see if you're going to need to do any replanting in the spring. So doing cleanup as needed. Deadheading, we had some discussion about that. Deadheading is common with like roses and peonies, horticultural species. We generally don't promote it a lot with natives because we want that seed source there for birds and other animals. And aesthetically, having the seed heads there can be a good thing. So we don't do a lot of deadheading with the native species. We really focus on that interest, visual interest, and then the wildlife habitat. Plant division. Fall can be a good time to do plant division and move plants around. We also do some of that early spring. But if you have plants that are doing really well, and there's a lot of species that you can divide, a lot of native species and horticultural species, it can be a great way to move those plants to another rain garden, like to your neighbors or anybody else that's doing a project. I guess one key thing is making sure as you do it, you're not mixing too much soil in with your mulch. You can promote weeds that way. But usually having a container like a wheelbarrow where you can dig up the plant, move it in there. You can kind of break that root system apart. Sometimes you'll need like a spade or something if it's a big root like an iris. Kind of break that apart. But species like asters, those will separate real easy and you can pull those apart and you can get a lot of plants out of one plum Sedges are the same. You can break those up pretty easily and get a lot of plants out of them. And then if you're doing it in the fall, just making sure that when you replant them, you water them well, because if that root totally dries out, it's not going to survive the winter. So you need to make sure there's enough water on it during the winter. That's why spring can be a good time, but you need to do it early spring. So sometimes it's good to flag a plant you want to divide in the spring so you know where it is. Come back to it in the spring, and then you can do that separation and move it around. Mulching can be done in the fall as well. If you're noticing that you do need more mulch, that can be added in the fall. We talked about cypress mulch is something we avoid. Peat, another material that we avoid because it does come from wetlands. So we tend to use compost, like for amending rain gardens instead of peat. And then winter, snow removal strategies, opportunities for bird watching, and then planning for the next year. One key thing with the snow removal is make sure there's not too much snow being piled on the rain garden, because that can compact it. You don't want all that weight pushing down and doing too much compaction. One other concern is salt. You don't want much salt coming to the rain garden. Salt can be a groundwater contaminant, so if you're getting a lot of salt coming into a rain garden, it can start moving down. We want to avoid that. It's also not good for the plants. A lot of prairie plants are somewhat salt tolerant because they're adapted to dry conditions where salt can build up, but they have their limits. And so if there's a lot of salt coming in, that's not going to be good for them. And so you really want to make sure there's not too much salt. And if you have salt mixed with snow or ice, you don't want that accumulating in the rain garden. So this is an aster here. You can see the seed head of that plant. There's a lot of interest to it there. Birds will use that in the winter, and so that's the reason that we leave a lot of these plants up through the winter and don't cut them back sooner, because you will get a lot of use by wildlife through the winter. Good hiding places for them in some cases if you have a lot of structure there, and you'll get other animals using it as well as habitat. So winter is a good time to kind of think about how the garden, whether it was successful or not during the year. Think about plans for the following spring. If you're doing additional rain gardens, you can think about what plants you might want to move to the new rain garden. And so it's a good time to get ready, gear up for the next year. Does anybody have any questions on the maintenance of rain gardens? Now, cypress is a tree that grows far southern United States, and it doesn't regenerate very fast. And the trees are being harvested just for mulch. And so these forests are being cleared for mulch. They're not coming back very well, and then it's being shipped a long distance. So there's a lot of fuel costs involved as well. And it's hard because cypress seems to be the most available mulch right now. You go to any gas station, they have cypress mulch. And so looking for other sources is important. And, but cypress does seem to be everywhere. So
Where do you go to get this?
Well, we talked about that in a previous class a little bit, and there are some garden centers that carry double-shredded hardwood mulch. Becky, you had a source that it comes in bales. I think it was Patio Town. Patio Town has bales of the double-shredded hardwood mulch.
We
a lot.
encourage people to go to their local hardware store and
That's a great idea. Yeah, the more we can ask for what we want, the more it's going to be available instead of less sustainable again.
You can get the mulch in bulk, so you're not creating all this plastic in the world. So you can go to Curtains, the Landscape Center in South Minneapolis. There's a lot of different places that you can buy it in bulk, by the cubic yard, and they'll deliver it right to your driveway.
Oh, wow.
And if you have multiple projects going on, that's a great way to kind of get it in one place, and then you can disperse it from there to projects.
Curtains and the Landscape Center here in South Minneapolis. They're on between Nicollet and Lindale Avenue on 61st Street.
What was the name? What was the name of the street?
The Landscape Center?
Yeah. Oh, that's the name. Okay. That's why I'm asking.
Dan, I have a question for you too. You said, can you repeat a little bit more about what happens if your garden gets sort of silted up or filled with sediment or something like that?
Yeah.
You said slow it down, right? So put rocks in?
Well, if it's, the source of sediment can vary a lot.
Okay.
And it may be that you just had like a construction project you've been working on, but it may be that you have like a channel forming and some of the sediment's flowing in. But we also get sediment accumulation just on pavement. Kind of from the atmosphere, just accumulates and will over time flow into these. And so you're bound to get some sediment accumulating in these. If you have a really big system and it's coming off of a parking lot, that's where you can get a lot of buildup. And usually it's going to be closest to the inlet, and so that's where you're going to have the most of it building up, and may need to do removal of it.
Okay.
And I guess if you do have a channel forming or something that's causing more of it to come in, that's when you want to look at solutions to stabilize that. And that's where plants that form rhizomes or maybe a whole bunch of clump forming plants will help slow that water flow. And just trying to get revegetated, or maybe you need some rock in there to kind of stabilize it to prevent any more sediment from flowing. But if you do have it building up in the garden, usually in a rain garden, you can go in there with a shovel and kind of scoop it out. You'll end up getting mulch with it. Put it into a wheelbarrow. You can probably compost that if you want. It won't be a huge amount of material. And so just removing as much as you need to, and then putting new mulch down is usually enough. And then you'll might have to do that each year if you have enough of it coming off of impervious areas. So just trying to keep up with it over time is usually enough, unless you have a big source all at once that's coming in from construction or something like that.
Yeah. Can all those pictures show the garden that looked like it was right up against that right there? So that straight line, is that like at the top of that rain garden? Oh, the picture right hand is there. Would that be like along the property line?
That one is usually a dark dash line is a property line. So it looks like that one is along a property line, which I guess usually we have a little setback there, just unless the neighbor is really okay with it being right there. But I guess there are some cases where you can go that close.
Because then you have like really tall plants there. And so it'd be like a division or something.
Yeah, it could be. It could be.
And I still don't understand the calculation, how you calculate the space of the rain garden. Are you going to talk about that? Like, so if your calculation is saying 80 square feet, where is the 80 square feet? Is it like from the outside boundary, or is it inside? Like, how do you know where to put that space?
Yeah. Well, usually we're planning it mainly from the outside boundary. You do have the slopes going down, and so ideally, I guess you'd go about halfway down your slope and measure it there. But we have a little wiggle room there, because like when a rain starts falling, you're going to have some infiltration happening right away. And our calculation that we're doing is for looking at total rainfall during that storm. And so you have a little wiggle room there so that you can measure it to the outside of the garden. That tends to be what I do, measure it to the outside, because you have it sloping down usually pretty fast. And then the calculation that we did for sizing was the square foot of the impervious area divided by the number of inches deep of your rain garden. And that'll give you your square foot area for your garden at that depth. And we had a handout last time that had calculations on it. And that was one of the calculations on there. So if you want to revisit that, find the handout and that should be on there. We had some of the algebra related to that on there too, so check that out.
So Dan,
Yeah.
are we saying that residential rain gardens typically don't get, are they pretty much good for like so many acres, or what's their experience with how long they've been working before they get clogged up? Like, you know, larger scale ones, they gotta do regular maintenance. Other than that fraction, you have to dig up the sediment.
Yeah, the length of these residential ones is usually pretty long. With like a biofiltration one that's next to a big parking lot, you know, the lifespan of before you need to maybe remove some sediment, larger amounts of sediment, can be like 5 years, 3 to 5 years. They've done studies on that, looking at the amount of nutrients that are I guess in some cases going into the groundwater, flowing out of the system after there's sediment accumulation. Even the mulch has some organic material in it and it'll have phosphorus. And so it depends on what's flowing in. And if you have a lot of salt flowing in, you know, that'll be a contaminant that you want to remove from it eventually. And so, like with a lot of things we've been discussing, it depends on your condition. And if you mainly have a rain garden that's getting roof runoff, it's going to be pretty clean. You're not going to have much accumulation there. If you have a larger parking lot area that's flowing in, you might get more sediment accumulation. But with the annual maintenance that you're doing for it, usually you're able to take care of that pretty well. That you're not at some point going to have to go in there and just kind of remove everything unless your depth is building up to a point where you're not getting the function that it's designed for. And that, you know, after probably 10, 15 years, that might be the case that you've been adding mulch over years, so your soil is building up. So you, at that point, you may need to go in there and kind of rework things, kind of remove things, possibly remove the plants if you can't dig down around them a little bit and put them back in. But you should have a good long time before you need to do that. And you know, I guess I have kind of reworked rain gardens that I've worked on in the past. But sometimes it's just one part of it that you need to rework, not the whole thing. So, you know, overall the lifespan is going to be pretty good. It's more with these larger fire retention systems that it's more often. Let's see, I'll pass out a handout, and we'll be looking at this in a minute. This is a forum for garden evaluations, and this is for recognition-based evaluation. And there's two types of evaluation that we'll be talking about, recognition-based and then regulatory-based. The part that you would get involved in would mainly be recognition-based, and the regulatory-based is more for organizations that are providing grants for BMPs. And I guess in both cases, the need is similar because there's lots and lots of these going in, and we need them to be successful, because if they don't look good, they're not good for promoting more of these in the future. And then if they're not functioning, then they're not providing the water quality benefits that we want. And that's a concern for using the recognition-based method, as well as for agencies or municipalities that are providing money for these gardens. We want to make sure that they're working. Recognition-based for garden award recognition tend to be more aesthetic focused, but there's also a functional side to that also. There's a variety of governments and nonprofits that are using the recognition-based method, and tends to focus more on rain gardens and than other types of gardens. Could be native plantings or boulevard gardens, perennial gardens. And so this form is the one developed by Metro Blooms for recognition-based evaluation. And we'll go through this next, talking about how you use it. But this is being developed into a web application. And so there'll be a form that can be filled out instead of just having a paper form like this. And it's been used by Metro Blooms. City of Minneapolis has been very involved with this as well. And they're interested in using the information collected through these evaluations to assess the status of gardens. And so that might be a role that you'd be involved in the future, is looking at number of gardens, looking at evaluating them using this method. And that information would go to the city. If the garden was getting a lower rating, that might indicate that then they need to send somebody else to look at it, make sure that it doesn't need some type of attention. Or if it's getting a really good rating, then they might be eligible for an award. So there might be multiple ways that this would be used, but overall the goal would be improving how rain gardens are evaluated, recognized for doing a good job, and solving any issues that arise. We'll also look at some forms a little later for regulatory-based evaluation. And it does tend to be more technical, more functional-based, whether things are functioning. Different reporting methods, there's different forms that have been developed by different groups for evaluating them. And they are applied to pervious pavers, pervious asphalt, a whole bunch of different BMP types. There's been forms developed for different ones. And so they get into different types of BMP. So getting into the form itself, you can see on the left side, there's different categories. And so each of those need to be evaluated separately. It starts off with the visual impact. And so that would be the first one that would be evaluated. And after we go through this, we'll look at some pictures of gardens, and we'll look at that together and discuss what we're seeing related to each of these categories. So we'll see what how we're interpreting visual impact. But it relates to color, texture, how the planting catches the eye, unique features within the garden. So, visually, how much does that garden stand out to you? And then we have the ratings for each factor: outstanding, above average, average, minimal, and none. There will be some subjectivity in this process, but that's why we want to look at some together and discuss how we can approach it.
As part of the ratings, are you saying average for a property or average for properties with these features? Or where's the balance? Since I mean, a rain garden, even if it scores poorly for weeding, environmental stewardship, or visual impact, if it's the only one in a square mile, it's going to be above average nonetheless. So, just kind of wondering, like, what those are referring to, what the context is.
Yeah. Well, in this case, for the work that you would be doing, you'd be looking at rain gardens. And well, there are a lot of rain gardens that have been designed through Minneapolis. And so you'd be kind of looking at them as a whole, comparing all the rain gardens that you might be looking at. And if you're being involved in the evaluation process, you probably have a number of them assigned to you to look at. So you'd be able to have a reference there to compare to and look at. So you may be looking over a pretty large geographic area, but would be comparing rain gardens in general. And so you'd have, I think, enough sites to look at and do some comparisons. And then average would be looking at that whole pool of projects. And through this process, you're probably getting exposed to a lot of pictures of gardens, at least. Going out and looking at some. I think it'll help as we look at some pictures and go out and talk about these and see kind of how we're all thinking about the rating system and how to use that. With plant variety and health, here we're looking at having some diversity in the planting, seasonal interest, looking for plants that are thriving, a mix of native, make sure there's some native species in there as well as horticultural species that are going to provide more wildlife benefits. Just overall health as well. If the plants look really dry, may not get rated as well, or if there's some disease issues with them, may not get as good of a rating. So that we'll look at pictures and discuss that as well. Overall design, we've talked a bit about trying to fit projects into the context and into other plantings on a residence. So kind of how is it fitting in overall to the setting and the residence? How's the overall balance of it? Is it well designed overall? Maintenance. We talked about different maintenance issues with sediment accumulation, making sure water isn't ponding too long, making sure you don't have any inlets, outlets that are plugged, having mulch in place, all of those maintenance issues that we've been talking about. Environmental stewardship, looking at maybe the type of mulch that they've used, are there native plants within the planting, where are the downspouts directed, looking at a number of issues related to kind of overall environmental benefit of that rain garden. Is it doing a lot of good? Is it collecting water where it would otherwise go off of impervious surface into a storm sewer? Is there a big benefit of that garden? Well, again, you use these ratings for each of these, give them each a score, and then add them up in the bottom so that individual garden would get a rating, a score. And then there's different categories on the form for related to the scores. So here, 14 to 17, category would be Garden of Distinction, so that is one of the upper categories for that one. So we have Exceptional Garden, Garden of Distinction, Garden of Merit, Certificate of Appreciation and No Award. And so if information was being sent to the city based on rain gardens, if it was a No Award level, then it may indicate that something needs to be done with that planting. And there may be special features, and this might relate to the environmental stewardship category. If there's, well, we would only be looking at rain gardens in this case, but if there's rain barrels or other infiltration features there that are helping to add to the benefits of the rain garden, maybe a trench that's collecting water from the driveway, pervious pavers in addition to rain garden, then that would add to the environmental stewardship. And then through this system, there's been awards given out for certain categories during awards banquets. And so ones that are rating really high, looking really good, would be eligible for other awards. Anybody have any questions on the form and how we use that? And again, this is being adapted into a web-based format, and I'm assuming it could be done on a phone. So this will take a different form in the future, and so it'll be more electronic and be submitted easier that way. There'll be a lot of benefits of having this electronic. So we'll have a chance to look at some gardens here and talk about grading some scores. So here we have a small rain garden up near the sidewalk. And so this is where we'd be looking at this garden. And if you're involved in evaluating these, you wouldn't have permission to walk on the landowner's property. And so unless you had special permissions for them to go and look at the garden. So if you're part of an evaluation process, you'd be able to get along the sidewalk and you might be invited in further, but essentially this evaluation is being done from publicly accessible areas. And so that's one thing to keep in mind as you're looking at this site. So you'd be looking at this site, and I guess my first impression of this one is that it's a relatively young planting, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Some of these plants look a little more mature. And so let's just, as a group, we'll go through here and discuss what you think of these different categories. So a little visual impact. What are you thinking with this garden?
Average.
It's a little bit unfair though because it's late April, early May in this picture, so it's
Maybe not on the full. I think we should just go with that.
I don't know. Never mind.
oh no, it's fine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to sound.
No.
You're right. It is early, but I was just like, go with our guts.
Well, then, even if it's early, look at the impact of that flowering tree there. That's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, there are opportunities for incorporating plants that look good early in the season. And so that is something to think about. You do have to compare these in a fair way, and so you may choose to do more of this evaluation during the summer when things are getting more mature, and maybe look at a bunch of them during a similar time of year so you can get a better assessment of that time of year. But we're getting leaves on plants, things are coming up, and if you're familiar with the plants, you'll get a pretty good sense of what they'll look like a little bit later if you were doing it during this time of year.
Okay, well, we can play Minnesota nice, so we can just check, okay? So we can say there's not really much difference in texture, nor in different colors, nor in shrubs versus flowers. And where's the exit for the overflow?
Looks like it's a sidewalk.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, it is
Sort of that
sidewalk. Yeah, those are all good observations. And I would have the same opinion. There's quite a bit of bare ground here. Even if those plants are more mature, you're still going to have that bare ground. You're not going to have a lot of emphasis from a lot of species here. You don't really see groupings of plants. You don't see much order in it, and so it may be providing some stormwater infiltration. I don't know if the plants are performing a big role with this planting. The visual impact, we'd be looking at a lower rating. Average or what about plants?
Start. That's a nice start.
But if we're going to go for the top garden in Minneapolis,
So if everything were average, they still get 10, they still get a garden of merit. So it's not like it's not like giving it a 0, but it is being.
I think that's a good thought. If you look at how they average out and what rating you would give it, if you gave it all average, garden of merits, and think about, okay, is this compared to all the other ones that I've been looking at, does this deserve that rating?
So what's the purpose of this evaluation? To encourage people to improve and to build rain gardens, or to give them awards? I would grade differently if I'm trying to encourage them to do that,
Yeah.
rather than if I'm trying to go, oh, I want the best rain garden acknowledged.
Well, I think there's different purposes. One is motivation, to motivate people to work hard on the gardens, because there may be an award involved. But ultimately, we want these functioning well, and I think that's the main point. And that would be the main point for the city using this form is, are these functioning as we want them? Are they good examples that are going to promote more rain gardens in other places? And so the more visually interesting these are, and more visual impact that we have, the more these will be promoted. And if we have ones that just aren't looking that great, and the perception is, I don't want a rain garden because my neighbors looks really weedy and doesn't look very good, then it's not going to promote more of these in the future. So that's one concern.
So that's what I think it would boil down to, is it functioning, is it being maintained? I mean, frankly, if the homeowner likes it that way, as long as it's performing and being maintained, and they don't care about it, I mean, I think the bottom line is that.
Yeah.
But maybe they don't even care about, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it may be, they'll get garden of merit. Maybe it's kind of average of gardens. They're happy with it. It's functioning, so we're happy with it. Maybe that's all fine.
Aesthetic,
Yeah.
like making them conform something that they don't want to conform to. As long as they're doing exactly what they want, they like their rocks and it's working. Maybe part of the problem here is what happens sometimes when you try to use the same thing for too many purposes. So this is a Metro Blooms farm, and they are looking for beautiful gardens as well as rain gardens. And I think what the conversation is saying is, if we're just evaluating rain gardens, are they working and are they doing what they're supposed to do? And then, as a bonus, do they look pretty? That's a different kind of orientation, and maybe these categories would be different.
Yeah, and I think
If that was the primary purpose.
I think that's something that can be looked at with the new format. I still say that aesthetics is important for promoting them,
Right.
so it does play a role. But your point is that the function of these is
Right. So then we'd be looking at maintenance in a different way than if you're looking at, they have their edges trimmed there. The flowers deadheaded. I mean, so we have a different orientation to what maintenance means if we're thinking about it in terms of the rain garden. And I think if you want to promote them to a certain aesthetic that's generally accepted by the populace, you have those certain targeted ones, and, where it's going to be a high traffic area, and get people to stop and get the wow factor, and leave, maybe someone who likes an Arizona high garden, different from the one that likes the lush. I don't know.
Yeah, I think those are good points. Those are things that can be considered as the form is adapted and tweaked. So that maybe for rain gardens it needs to be a little different.
Yeah, are you evaluating it as being the top garden, as in a garden club, or are you looking at this and saying, would you like some suggestions? Are you happy with what you have? And it's not going to be one display, but recognizing them for a reason. But as you say, going for the top ones so that other people go, oh, it's not just a weekend, or it's not just a bunch of village.
Yeah, and I
You're using the same form, but just a different
that's good. Let's move on to the plant variety and health. Any thoughts on plant variety and health?
They look healthy.
Yeah, the varieties. We're looking for more diversity for habitat value. So we would be sparse there. Overall health, are looking pretty green and lush. So it's looking pretty good on that side. So any thoughts on what rating you would give that one?
Average.
Average. Okay.
Yeah, I bet you if you looked at that one in the fall, it would look pretty filled in. Because we can go into our prairie garden, and my wife can tear out all kinds of stuff in 2 months. It's like a tumbleweed. So
It's a really good point with prairie plants. You know, they really don't get active until late May, and so you're not going to have much filling in. So that's a good observation. And it may be there could be some prairie plants in there, and you know, again, maybe a good reason to kind of focus these more mid-season, right in summer, when you can make a better assessment of all of them, and see what's happening. How about design?
I don't think those rocks are going to make it a whole year.
Yeah.
One shoveling, one winter or something, you know. Unless they're
Shoveling.
They're just wasted.
I would give them credit for having rocks, something besides just mulch.
Yeah, it's a visual element there. You know, it's creating a sense of order. Maybe burying these in a ways so that they're not going to move and they're still there as that visual edge, but in place better would be helpful. So those are good observations. You know, it is in a kind of corner here, so it's kind of fitting in, creating some spaces. You can see some spaces being developed in here. So it's kind of framing some of the yard. So from a design standpoint, those are good things. So any thoughts on ratings for design? Average. All right. Average mulch in there. So what do you think on the maintenance side? Above average. Then environmental stewardship. So here we're looking at materials used. What is the environmental benefit of this project?
They took out turf.
Yeah, they removed turf, so there's less mowing.
Right.
Yeah,
It looks like
that's
that
true.
corner on the other side of what looks to be a driveway and this boulevard might also be rain garden because it looks like there's a dip off the sidewalk.
Yeah. Could be multiple little ones that are providing a benefit, so that's all beneficial. What about a rating?
Green.
Okay, so above average.
It's green.
But it's coming back.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's got a
Yeah,
concave
you're right.
in the boulevard,
Ah, you're right.
which is really hard to achieve.
And I think anytime you get into the state turf out of their front yard, you've got to use president.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah, I agree, and they've done it in multiple places here. So that's all going to have a benefit, decreasing the amount of lawn. So we're at Garden of Merit. This is where we're at with this one. 9 to 13. I'm not sure how many of these we'll get through, but we'll we'll get a couple more. Well, let's see. This one was similar to the last one.
Wow.
Whose son is
Attainable
that?
by me.
Metro Blooms.
Well, let's go through this one. We'll go through these a little
So is
faster.
this in fall?
There's a whole block of
This in fall?
Well, this is probably late summer.
Okay, because of the pocket spray. I was just in the rain garden.
Yeah, you can't see if they have an award.
Yeah.
So visual impact for plant variety and health,
This time of the year, it's great.
for design,
Three. I'm gonna go with you on 3 on that one.
maintenance,
We gave them all fours.
pretty good. Got small, can't see any other issues happening.
There's a pathway, so there's some pathway.
Yeah, there's some of the mulch showing.
Be interesting to see how that fit in with the rest of the neighborhood, like
Yeah.
angle from the side too.
Sorry, what was that?
It's impressive from this way, but how does it fit in with the rest of the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, maybe it's a quick line to the lawn on the other side, but I guess, you know, they can't
Can't
control that.
What about really tall grasses on right?
This is Carl Forrester grass, the tall, upright grass. And then environmental stewardship.
Part of that, how can you judge that in some ways unless you know what problems they're solving? As far as, was there a big problem with rain runoff or that?
Yeah,
To me, that would be one of the biggest.
yeah, you know, in some cases, if you have the stormwater management plan, if you have access to that, that can be a good information source because you can look at kind of what was there before the project was put in. So having more information or talking to the landowner about what was happening before would all be good information. But yeah, you know, if we're looking at making an environmental difference, you kind of need to know what was there before this was there. Maybe it was a rain garden, or you know, we don't know.
I can agree with this just because from what we can see in this picture, because it obviously provides habitat for wildlife, and there's a significant turf reduction, but we can't see anything as far as redirecting downspouts or a rain barrel or things along those lines that would bring this up above that classification.
Yeah, it seems like it would take more investigation to see what's actually happening here. There aren't a lot of native species here, but I think there's a lot that would provide pollinator habitat. There's so many flowers here. Only native I recognize maybe columbine, blue fescue, but that's not quite native. But you know, I think there'd be a lot of wildlife habitat still.
These gardens on the list where the people know they're going to be evaluated, or do you just randomly drive down the street and
Some of both.
Yeah, I think typically they're ones that have been funded, and so they'll have a list of ones that have public funding. On the case of the Minneapolis ones, so they'll have a list that
Metro
can be
Blooms
assessed.
encourages citizens to nominate gardens. So if you have a neighbor that has a great garden, you could nominate them, and then Metro Blooms will assign an evaluator to go.
Let's hope they warn the homeowner. I really pissed off. Somebody came over and the day before I was going to leave. Oh wow!
No, this is an opportunity that both Metro Blooms and Minnehaha Creek Watershed District are interested in working with stewards on, is to have you do some of the outreach through evaluation.
Right.
And that involves either leaving a card on the door saying, I'm a water steward, I'd love to talk to you about the garden, or a phone call and saying, I'm going to be in the neighborhood, any gardens in the neighborhood, I'd love to talk with you about how yours is going. That can all be part of the volunteer stuff that you do. It's a real high need. There's a high need for both Metro Blooms and for Minnehaha Creek to evaluate gardens to raise the profile.
So I think, you know, we're essentially giving this one a high rating. It's going to be within the 18 to 20 range.
So wait, now I have a question though. When you said they were non-native, so I didn't really know that. Does that come into play on the rating? I mean, it seems like it should, but
Yeah,
This is the same one. This is another.
if you read the environmental stewardship category, turf reduction, plants beneficial to wildlife, conservation inputs, that's using the right mulch and things like that, redirecting downspouts, concave boulevard, if it's a, well, in this case, you'd only be looking at rain gardens, you wouldn't have a concave boulevard. And then other features. So it's going to come down to beneficial to wildlife, you know, and I mentioned that one didn't necessarily have many natives in it, but it's going to have a number of mint species, poppies, different things that are going to be providing pollinator habitat. There's a lot of structure here. with wildlife, we look for structure. There's plants of different heights, there's grasses, there's flowers. There's a lot of habitat there for different critters. And so this ultimately is going to be pretty good habitat. It may not have the deep root systems possibly in some of the native plants, so you may not be getting quite as much infiltration as if you had some big blue stem here or Indian grass. But there's still a lot of positive things that are happening. But so I maybe knock it down one notch or something, maybe because it's not seeing as many natives. It's all, and you're looking at all the categories. So that's what you're looking at when you're considering that. But there's a lot of benefit of what's here.
But it is listed among
Yeah.
all kinds of plants.
How about this one? So starting with visual interest, you'd be pretty high there. Plant variety and health.
Tons of natives.
Variety of structure there again. Yeah, a lot of natives in here.
So point out what some of them are. And what are they?
There's a common oxeye. That's Heliopsis helianthoides. Purple coneflower.
What's the purple one in the front?
That's a liatris, probably Liatris spicata. There's coral bells here.
Moving coreopsis. Or on the street side.
Down here. This looks like stiff goldenrod here. That looks like Russian sage. I think that grass is Karl Forster grass there. So it's a mix of native, non-native. What about design?
Doesn't have much of an edging on it.
Yeah, you can see some of the grass creeping in. Maybe it could have come back to the edge, just to extend it back a little further. Kind of tied in more with the building, but overall not bad.
So it looks like we're just relying on spray from the downspout. There's nothing at the end of the downspout directing the water directly.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to drop.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at too.
Flow over.
And it's on the backside too, and you can see kind of that there's some finish areas in the grass to help you see what the flow is going with them. So it looks like it's going directly into it.
That grass really doesn't look very healthy there. It could be some compaction that's happening because of, it's hard to know why, but that may be some issues with the lawn there. So that's not providing too much of a filter. You get good thick grass, that can be a good filter for water moving through. It'll reflect some of the sediment injection.
So I think you suggested that they could have brought the garden all the way back to that river rock border there, but my problem with that would be that it might make it harder to maintain because there's no pathway there to get at weeding and so forth. So what are other possible solutions to that icky grass problem that they've got there?
Well,
Yeah, maybe.
I suppose they can move that rock out further.
Or bring the rock out further, yeah.
Or maybe this could be a shrub planting back here.
Or mulch.
Or it could just be mulch. Yeah, it could be maintained as mulch back here. If it's mulch, you're going to have a hard time kind of working the water through there without it washing the mulch away.
Yeah.
So you might need some stone or something here as a little pathway for the rock to come through. So it could be a combination of things that you can do back there.
Okay.
You may not want to depress it here because you are getting close to a cement foundation, so you may not want it really close to that. Then maintenance.
Pretty good.
that edging sort of the boundary.
It doesn't look like there are weeds in the garden itself.
Just along the edges.
Yeah, just kind of creeping into the edges.
It's way too close to the house.
Well, it's closer than we typically design them, right? You know, if it is just a slab,
Looks like a
It's like
garage.
a garage.
yeah, it may just be a slab there. So there is brick. I don't like getting too much moisture up against brick. You do have more porous surface there. But, you know, it's maybe a little closer than we normally design it. And then environmental stewardship. I believe that would be letting water out.
That's the overflow, yeah.
It's not a very big garden to be taking street water in. And there'd be a larger curb cut there. I think it's just flowing out and then dropping over the curb. Well, I think it's not a full curb. So, yeah.
A lot of habitat good for data. This is on here, good for wildlife. Also, a lot of food for wildlife.
Yeah.
And this was
Yeah, kind of medium for wildlife maybe. It's not a very big area. It's kind of isolated. It's not connected to other plantings. So wildlife probably aren't going to be using it as much as if it was connected to some other areas.
But relative to what they've got there for opportunity, it is, they've practically maximized it.
Yeah.
you've got the redirect to zombie zones.
Yeah, we don't know in this case if there was maybe a better place to place it or if there was some other opportunity. But here, you know, if you want to collect this water, this is the place to have the rain garden. They're not going to have it somewhere else. So, no, I think this one we're probably around the range of garden of distinction. So it's up there a little higher. So it seems like we're generally in consensus about a lot of these as we're looking at them. Well, why don't we take a break? We've been going for about an hour and a half, so we've been sitting for quite a while. Let's take a 10-minute break, and when we get back, we'll talk about regulatory. So we discussed regulatory-based evaluation used by different cities, conservation districts, watershed management organizations, watershed districts. So really designed to assess the effectiveness of BMPs. Tend to be more technical and detailed with the evaluation. And so they'll have different reporting forms that have been developed for doing these evaluations. You type in or Google stormwater treatment, assessment, and maintenance. You can get to this site that has been developed by the University of Minnesota. And there's a lot of information here on assessing BMPs. Goes into a lot of detail about pollutants within BMPs and maintenance needs. But they also, well, this goes into a lot of detail about different types of best management practices and why the maintenance is important, how to maintain them. There are forms on the site, and so this would be an example of a regulatory-based form. It goes into a lot of detail, a lot of questions about, in this case, bioretention practices, including rain gardens. So these could be big bioretention areas that are planted, or rain garden plantings. So there's a lot of questions here, and I'll pass this around. You can get a sense of what type of information they're looking for in this case. And so this is a 4-page form versus the 1-pager that we've been looking at for the more basic evaluation. So this is one example.
So Dan,
Yeah.
previously what we were talking about was pretty much related to residential rain gardening. Now we're looking at commercial development, municipalities, other public organizations, etc.
Yeah, that's generally the case. Some of this is done on residential sites that have been funded by maybe a watershed district or a conservation district.
But then they're
So-
like as a whole, not individual houses or yards. So
Yeah, somebody going out and using this form, let's say a watershed district funded a project, they may choose to use this more detailed form to go out and assess how effective this project is. So it could be at a residence, probably more commonly at a business, a place where they're using pervious pavers or pervious asphalt, different types of BMPs. And so that tends to be more of the focus of this type of evaluation than smaller residential rain gardens aren't the focus quite as much. So this form is going around. This is on that website. This is some other examples. This is from Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District, and they have forms. It's a one-page sheet for different best management practices. So we have pervious pavers as an example here, and it'll go through and ask different questions, answer yes, no, and if yes, it lists different maintenance that might be needed related to that. Here's a summary of pervious pavers. First question is, are weeds growing between pavers? So if there are weeds growing in there, that's something you don't want. So you would check yes there. Has sediment accumulated between the pavers? That's another thing that is really important with these pervious pavers, that you don't get sediment accumulating. So they use trucks with brushes. If it's at a residence, you can use like a shop vac, cleaning most of that out. Our trash, excessive leaves, grass clippings, or other debris present. Are any pavers damaged or broken? Has the fill material between pavers been depleted? Is there standing water on or between the pavers 48 hours or more after a rainfall? So those are some of the main things that they're interested in for that type of best management practices. But then we have one for rain gardens, one for bioretention basins, which are large rain gardens essentially. Pervious pavement, it's been getting more press recently, different types of pervious pavement. Grass pavers, where you have grass growing through the paver. And underground infiltration. And so these are different ones that they've developed for monitoring ones that they've funded.
Have you used grass pavers? I mean, we saw a picture of it one time in a kind of a driveway area.
Yeah, and that was one that Rusty had designed. I haven't personally used those. And so I, in his design, I was at that site with him, and he had a strip where the car would drive up, and in between where the tires would go was grass. And it seems like a good practice, partly because the grass is going to help slow up water, so that's an additional benefit of those.
So what's below them? So if it was some kind of plastic structure, is what's below them like what's below regular pervious pavers?
Well, the grass is going to need some growth medium, where with the regular pervious pavers, it's just going to be stone underneath. So I haven't designed with those, so I'm not sure exactly how that's structured, but I think you're going to need some growth medium there to sustain that grass. So it's going to have a different element there. We don't have that as a handout. I'll pass these around. These are inspection guides developed by Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. These are really well developed. These are really good resources. And I have one here on filtration practices, infiltration bases and trenches, bioretention, so rain gardens, and swales. So it covers a number of different techniques, and it'll talk about those in here. But one nice thing about this is it's really well designed. It'll go through kind of the routine maintenance that's needed. And then I'll talk about some of the issues that can occur on these different best management practices, and it goes into a fair amount of detail about them. So sediment accumulation, percent vegetative cover, making sure there's enough vegetative cover there. If you start getting aquatic vegetation, it means you're too wet. So, and it does give some solutions as well. So that's another nice thing about these. Erosion in gullies forming, litter and debris, healthy vegetation, bare soil, compaction, turf evaluation, and plant evaluation. So it covers a lot of topics, gives a good summary on those topics. And so as you're kind of learning more about this is a good resource to look at. There's one here for permeable pavers. So I'll go into a little more detail about issues about maintenance on those. There's also one I printed off on stormwater ponds, wet ponds, retention ponds. And so this focuses on those larger pond areas that you see for collection of stormwater and some of the issues related to those. So good resources. There is an evaluation form also that goes along with the rain garden one. And so that's a one-page form. So I'll pass this around. You can look at some of the topics or some of the questions they're asking. It's similar to other ones that we've been looking at. Where does water that's flowing on the BMP come from? Do you know standing water in your BMP beyond 48 hours? Looking at sediment, erosion, litter, looking at the health of the turf grass around it, health of the plants, looking at the inlets and outlets. And so it's not that different than a lot of the other things we've been looking at and talking about with the other assessment methods. So this we'll pass around also. So as you get more familiar with rain gardens and different best management practices, this could be something that you could expand into potentially doing these types of evaluations. A lot of these questions are not getting into a lot of detail. You've been learning a lot about these BMPs and rain gardens, and so you're getting a lot of expertise on this topic, and so this is definitely an area that you could expand into in the future as well. So that was kind of a quick introduction to the regulatory side. Does anybody have any questions about these forms or how people are using this information?
Who's using these forms? Is somebody employing somebody to be an inspector, and the inspectors are going out and looking at what?
I think most of the watershed districts, conservation districts that are developing them do have people that are going out and doing a lot of inspections.
Okay.
But as we get more and more of these in the landscape, then it's harder for them to have time to look at all these. So I think there's going to be a greater need for other people to be involved in looking at these that have been educated and know what they're looking at. But it seems like a lot of these places do have people, the PCA has people that go out and look at detention ponds and things like that as well, doing inspections. So there are people hired to do this, but then I think there's going to be a need for additional people to do it. Hopefully we see more and more of these being installed, and that just creates more need for people to go out there and do these inspections. Any other questions on that? All right, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. we're planning to look at 2 sites that are about 3 blocks away. And this is the first one that we're planning to go to is at 5525 Park Avenue. And I'm not familiar with this area too much, so I may...
2 blocks over.
Okay, well, 2 blocks over that.
That's the sport.
Okay. So, it may be within walking distance. If you want to walk over there, it's probably close enough. But this is going to be the last thing we do for the day. These are close together, and so if you do want to drive there and leave from there, you can do that. Then you wouldn't need to walk back.
You think maybe a half hour? I'm calling for a ride. So
Okay.
you think it'll be about a half hour altogether? Or we're going to go till 9?
Well, I think if we walk there and back, we might be going closer to 9. But if you need to leave earlier, that's fine.
Oh.
Yeah. So I think by the time we look at both, then bring along your evaluation form because we're going to look at those gardens and fill out this evaluation.